In Namen von dem Bund will ich anerkennen die traditionelle Abhüter von Land, wo wir treffen sich heint, das Wurundjeri-Volk von dem coolen Volk. Und wir geben ab Koved seine Imes und Oves von dem Over, von dem Ossid und Zukünftige. Shalom Aleichem, Zuhörer. Ich begrüße euch wieder im Namen von der Bundorganisation in Melbourne. Ich hoffe, dass ihr seid alle gesund und in der Heim. Wir führen on noch alt mit unseren Podcasten, wo wir reden wegen in Jonem, was haben zu tun mit jüdisch Leben und Kultur. Arnold Zable is the author of 8 widely acclaimed books, a fierce advocate for refugee rights and those seeking asylum in Australia, and for addressing the plight of Indigenous Australians. But to many of our listeners, Arnold is an eigener, one of us, ours. Of course, he's also all those other things that I mentioned, but Arnold grew up in Skiff in Carlton, initially as a skiffist, later as a helfer and Lagerkommandant, before moving into Zukunft and the Bund. I have known Arnold for more than 60 years, when I too became part of Skiff in Melbourne, and I can remember football games, St Kilda Skiff versus Carlton Skiff, and Arnold was like a mosquito running around on the ovals trying to get a kick. So Arnold, welcome and khaver.
Khaver, Allan.
If there is such a thing as a creative gene, then surely it exists in the Zable family. Your father, Meyer, was a poet who, because of circumstances, was forced to earn a living selling his wares at the Victoria Market. You speak of your mother's beautiful singing voice as she sang the Yiddish songs that's so beloved by her. Your older brother Ben, or Benny as we knew him, was a painter, and I recall he was also into dance from an early age. And Ben was one of the pioneers of Nimbin, as I recall. Your younger brother Harry, with whom I shared a tent on camps for many years, has of late become a painter of water-based rural scenes around Castlemaine, where he now lives. And yourself. Now that's pretty impressive. In an article by Jane Sullivan in The Age earlier this year, she described you as sitting on the Canning Street median strip in Carlton, telling made-up stories to a friend, or to your younger brother Harry at home at night, through a hole in the wall. Arnold, when did you realise you had a talent for storytelling and that it was something you could make a living from?
Oh, that took a long time. That scene you painted of sitting on the lawn in Canning Street telling stories, I think that's part of it. I love telling stories, and I used to take my brother Harry. There was a hole in a crack in the wall above my bed, and we slept in the same room. I used to take him down that passageway and tell him stories about, all kinds of imagined people and adventures that took place down that hole. But also, I think it was a kind of a house of stories in a way, and there were and when I say a house of stories, there were the stories that were told, and there were the stories that were hidden, that weren't told, that were there under the surface. The ghosts, I guess, that were in the house, a tragedy that had taken place that my mother in particular was very troubled by. So I was always aware of that, acutely aware of that. But also I must say I was an avid reader of literature, and but I read literature. I read Yiddish literature. I was introduced to Yiddish books by my father, of course. He brought books to Australia. He lugged them from Bialystok. But also I was introduced to Yiddish literature by Giligich, the famous pedagogue and headmaster, legendary headmaster of the E.L. Paddock School. And then when I'd read all the Yiddish books there, he he helped me sign up to the Kadima Library. I was just 11 years old when you had that little shtiebel in Lygon Street next to the big Kadima, and I would go there and borrow Yiddish books. And then I also fell in love with the literature of Dickens and Dostoevsky and all those great classics, and in particular John Steinbeck. John Steinbeck's Grapes of Wrath made a great impression on me. So it was there, but it took a while because I took a long detour, and I was a lecturer in political science, anthropology, did all kinds of things before finally I guess it came to a point when I realized that I would regret it if I did not try in some way to practice the craft of story. So I actually left that university job and I took the risk. And the key turning point actually was the journey I took to Poland in 1986 to track down, now going back to that issue of voices in the house and stories in the house, to try in a way to track down the mystery, the stories that were not told and what lay behind it. And that eventuated into my first book, the Jewels and Ashes. But one other thing I'd want to say is that I kept journals on my journeys, even before then. And so, in a way, I was practicing putting to paper and encapsulating through the written word what I was experiencing as I travelled.
Arnold, you're much more often described as a storyteller than a writer. Is there a difference between them? And if so, what is it?
I think that they're closely integrated, really. I do actually perform as a storyteller, and if there is a difference, there's a difference between telling stories, say, on stage live, and writing stories. When you tell them live, there is an element of excitement that unexpected things can come as you tell the story. And some of the stories that I've written have come out of stories that have been performed as an oral storyteller, where I have discovered the story in the telling. But I think really when it comes to the written word, there's a craft. I practiced the craft. I'm still on a learning curve. I still think I'm learning the craft. There's the art of scene construction, how you construct scenes. There's the art of how you create tension in stories. But for me, I think the bottom line is the beauty of language. I think language is very, very important, and you work at getting it right. And so I think that they're more closely linked than we realize, than is sometimes said or assumed. Let's have a look at, say, Tolstoy and Hugo, right? Those two writers. They were storytellers, brilliant storytellers. They could tell a great story, Les Miserables, The Hunchback of Notre Dame. But at the same time, they were writing essays. They were writing commentaries on their times and weaving them into those novels, actually. So literature strays beyond the storytelling in many ways, many different kinds of ways. And these are things I'm still exploring.
Right. Arnold, you mentioned before that you took your first trip to Poland to try and understand the untold stories that existed in your home. But it wasn't until 5 years later that your first book, Jewels and Ashes, came out. Now, that was 1991, and it wasn't till 1998 that your second book, Wanderers and Dreamers, hit the shelves. And since then, you've published a book about every 2 to 3 years. Why the 7-year break between the first and the second one?
Well, first of all, wonderful things were happening in my life. The birth of Alexander, and I spent a lot of time immersed in that, including taking journeys to Greece, where my wife Dora's family comes from, to the island of Ithaca, and spending sometimes 3 months on end living in the village that her father was born in. Up the mountain, you could see the village where her maternal ancestors came from. And also, I was learning the craft. It's a very interesting question. You're one of the few people that has picked up on this. At that time, apart from having to earn a living and finding different ways to earn a living, I was learning the craft, and I was finding my way. It's the notorious second book blues, they sometimes call it, and a lot of the books that came out in quick succession in, say, 2001, 2002, 2004, those books, Khaver, Scheherazade, Scraps of Heaven, The Victory, and then Sea of Many Returns, the novel set in Greece. A lot of those books I'd been sort of playing around with them, trying to work ways in which to tell them in that period. So, it was a period of fertilization, and fortunately, it did come to fruition finally. And I'm glad I didn't publish in that decade, because I think there was a lot I needed to learn and to work out and to practice.
Arnold, when many of us think about growing up, we fondly recall the past through rose-coloured glasses, and we remember a past that really wasn't the way we choose to remember it. And Carlton looms very large in many of your books, and you reference it in speeches that I've heard you give. Have you idealised Carlton? What was so special about it?
First of all, I don't think I've idealised it. In fact, the novel that really looks at Carlton is Scraps of Heaven, and I fictionalised, made it into a fiction. Josh, the main character, is partly based on me, but once I took on that identity of Josh and began to tell it in the third person, it enabled me to create a vast gallery of characters, but the main characters are in part based on, Zofia is based on my mum, Romick partly based on my dad, Bloomfield, another character, is a person that I knew used to wander the streets of Carlton, and the picture I paint there is also a picture of great trauma. And that within my own house growing up, there was joy and celebration of the Yiddish word of the Yiddish language through my mum's song that she was constantly singing around the house. Her repertoire was vast, but there was an edge to her singing. This was a voice stilled. A lot of my writing is about voices that have been repressed, voices that have been stilled, and voices that are not heard. And that's connected to the work I've done, say, with refugees and other things that I've written about. And so that book is a celebration of Carlton as a diverse multicultural neighbourhood before multiculturalism was even around or in vogue as a way of looking at who we are. So I wanted to cross those boundaries. At the heart of it is 387 Canning Street, that little cottage we grew up in, and then the neighbourhood and those streets that we knew so well. The maps, I wanted to map that Carlton, to bring in the Jewish Carlton, the Kadima, the local shopping strip, the butcher, the baker, the candlestick maker. You had Glickman the baker, and Gottlieb the greengrocer, and Halperin the hairdresser. And I also wanted to show that even for those characters, these were people that were trying to find their feet. This was the immediate post-war years. It's a novel about people trying to find their roots. And if I had to sum it up in a way, I'd sum it up like this, that when you write stories like this, I'm acutely aware that we are dealing in a way with a 3-act drama, right? And now this is a rough generalization. There are many exceptions to this, but there is the time before. Once I had a home in Bialystok or in Warsaw, or once I had the ancient dreaming, if we talk about indigenous people, or once upon a time I lived in a village in Italy, or once upon a time I had a beautiful town that I came from on the island of Ithaca, and then so I weave that past in, and then something happens. And Act 2 is when that something happens. It could be war, pogrom. It could be many variations on why people flee their homelands or leave their homelands. Sometimes it's because they're the black sheep of the family, like the Italian bootmaker that we all loved and had a shop front for many years in Rathdown Street. And when he came to Australia, he found himself. So Act 2 can last a long time. The people on Manus Island, those that were put away as part of the so-called Pacific solution, Nauru and Manus, some of them are still not free yet. They're still in Act 2. In search of that place. But Act 3 is that long roller coaster that takes place once you do settle in another place. And that is full of light and dark. There are many shades to that.
In 1956, my grandparents bought a shop in Fitzroy and shifted out. We'd lived together in an extended family setting. I used to go there Friday nights and I would stay with my grandparents. And they were diagonally opposite a pub. And most Friday nights it was a 6 o'clock swill. There were invariably fights as the men poured out of the pub. Now, Fitzroy and Carlton are unrecognisable now to people in from those days. They were working class suburbs, and in those suburbs there was violence, there was domestic violence, there was poverty, there was wonderful family connections, there was incredible support for each other. But I have a sense that in your writings you don't touch on those other more difficult aspects of life in what were then in a city working class suburbs.
Well, actually, in Scraps of Heaven, there are a number of characters that, in particular, Shanahan, a truck driver who lived a couple of doors up, who I do describe the domestic violence that took place. And, I describe some of the guys that used to come home drunk and smash in the windows, try to kick in the doors. It's there. Mm-hmm. And you see, I think really I'm always acutely aware of that shift between the light and the dark. I think that sometimes people read me in a certain way, rather than see it's a two-way dialogue, and particularly in Scraps of Heaven, I think there you'll have you have it there. It's bubbling under the surface, and sometimes it springs out. And it's interesting also the anti-Semitism, the gang that roamed the streets that I describe in Scraps of Heaven. And they used to grab you, and it was ridiculous in a way, kiss the ground and say, I killed Jesus. And I've woven those scenes woven in the fear too. There was a scene set at a football match in Collingwood at Victoria Park where, you looked at someone the wrong way, and the next thing you knew, you were being chased by drunks down Johnson Street. And the fear that was in you, and the drink, what the drink did to people and still does to people, it's all there. And then if you say in Scraps of Heaven in particular, it's divided up into 4 seasons. That's the way it's structured. And the winter is one long descent into the darkness. It includes the boxing world. And the boxing world was mixed. The boxing world that I describe, I actually did train in a gym And then later on, of course, I wrote The Fighter about the Nissen twins. And that was part of my world too. And and once again, there was something noble about that world, right? The trainer, the old trainer that I revisited and interviewed and based a character on him. He used to say, my job was to turn louts into gentlemen, right? To give them the discipline. And then on the other hand, you saw the brutality, the lust, the bloodlust that was there. And also, I want to make this point. At the heart of, I think we're looking at the heart of who I am and who I became in a way. And that is that you have in that formative Carlton that I grew up in, right? You had on the one hand, you had that the Jewish world with all its different shades too. My mother in particular and characters based upon her haunt my books. They haunt my books, and they let rip at certain points with their pain, but they also have joy. They have the joy. My mother had the joy in song. My father had the joy in Yiddish poetry. I had within me the joy of the streets too, and I also wanted to cross the boundary. And now this is something that's became central to my life, crossing boundaries. And we lived side by side with working class Australian families and Greeks and Yugoslavs and Italians, and all of them have played into my life. And this became, in a way, the basis of how I saw my life and lived my life. And that is that there was a core that Bundist, Yiddishist, great humanitarian, secular Yiddish culture, the Yiddish guy I was brought up in, with mentors like Bonavina and many others, and but with all its shades of light and dark. But also there was the fact that I saw a wider world. I fell in love with that wider world, and I began making connections with that world. For example, I'll never forget the first Greek party I went to. I was a teenager, and I was coming home. And so in a way, I lived in Shtetl Carlton, but Shtetl Carlton was not only a Jewish Carlton. It was rich with so many other worlds. And in a way, that became the template when I now look back over the years of how I lived my life. And in a way, I think I've always, as a traveller, I've always been in search of the shtetl.
Be it a Greek village or the Yiddish shtetl.
Oh, look, I'll tell you a more interesting example, which the first journey that I did overseas was to Papua New Guinea. And this was in 1967. And I remember I was immersed in European history and politics as a student at Melbourne University. And I just, towards the end of that year, read an advertisement in Farrago about a village scheme and working in village cooperatives. And look, to cut a long story short, within 2 months, I'm flying to Papua New Guinea, and I spent about a month in a village called Marani village. And I felt totally and utterly at home from the moment I stepped into that village. It was intimate. It had echoes of what I'd experienced in Carlton and on skiff camps even, the collective life that they lived there. And that became a big part of my life. And I went back again and again and again and became an activist in terms of New Guinea independence movement, connections there as a student with our student movement. And so that... But the point I want to make here is that I felt at home. I felt at home, in the new book, The Watermill. The first story is set in Huaxi, beautiful hamlet in a remote part of China. And I was there. I was the only Westerner at this particular college and only one of 3 or 4 in the whole province. And yet I felt totally and utterly at home because it was a kind of shtetl that I lived in. And that warmth, that intimacy, that welcoming was there. And so, yeah, I think that's the biggest story of what Carlton meant and how it threaded through my life in various ways.
Arnold, in many of your books, you write about people you've known for many years. You've got Sonia Lizaron and Pincher Vina in The Windmill. You've got actors from the David Howman Theatre Group in Wanderers and Dreamers. You have the Zheleznikovs in Cafe Scheherazade. How do you remain clear-eyed about people you know and admire, about who they are and what they've done and achieved?
It's a very, very good question, and there are 2 states that you can be in, or many states, but there are 2 very different states you can be in as a writer, one can say, and one is the witness state and one as a subject, right? In the witness state, you try to stay detached and to see people from a distance, whereas as a subject, you're part of the story. So part of it is working out where the boundaries are, and if you are going to cross the boundaries. In fiction, you stay in the witness state. And even when I was writing about Carlton in Scraps of Heaven, the moment I stopped writing in the first person and started writing in the third person, right, then I think I had an objectivity, even in the way I see myself and the way I interacted with others, because I had to imagine different points of view. And this, I think, is the bottom line. The bottom line is the worst thing you can do in story is to prejudge and to presume. What you do instead is you try to enter into the guise of the character. How do they see the world? How does it look like to them? And to be able to do this, first you've got to have known people for a long time and to have had probing conversations. With Zheleznikov, we had many, many long conversations, and to his credit, he was prepared to go into the darker sides of who he himself was, the contradictions that we all have as human beings. And so out of this, hopefully, comes you create characters and scenes that are real, that are true to life, and don't idealize on the one hand, but there's the other danger too. You see, on the one hand, there's a danger of idealizing it, but on the other hand, there's also the danger of seeing things, not seeing the beauty, not seeing the saving graces, not seeing that which makes a human being more than what has happened to them. It's a very important point I want to make here, and that is that I never write of people as victims. I try to see them as agents of their own stories, and I try to have their voice heard. We're going back to my mother, who wanted desperately to have her voice heard, and the only way you could understand my mother is by sitting with her and just listening, entering into her world, not trying to confront her world. It took a long time, but as a young child, I had to learn that. If I wanted to be with her, I had to learn to sit with trauma, as well as have my ears open to the beauty of that mezzo-soprano that ran through the house.
Arnold, can I just follow that up a bit? In The Fighter, where you write about Leon and Henry Nissen, the mother, who's got severe mental illness, features quite prominently in that book. Are you really writing about your experiences with your mother when you're describing her?
Yes and no. Yes and no. And I think writers draw on many things when they write their stories. And interestingly enough, there is a scene in Scraps of Heaven, and which took me a long time to be able to read in public, right? Where there is an encounter between Josh and Zofia, mother and son, and it goes to the heart of something. It goes to the heart of just living with this beautiful, beautiful person, a getreie mame, right? Who, on the other hand, could fall into a very dark space, into a kind of psychic rage. And there I actually, because it was fiction, wove in some of the stories I'd heard from the Nissen twins, who I was already having conversations with. But when it comes to the fighter, yes, there's no doubt that that there were similarities, but they were also different. And where my understanding of my mother comes in is that I was alert to what they were saying about her. When they talked about her, when Henry and Leon talked about their mum, and Sandra, their sister, and Paul, their other brother, when they talked about them, I knew where they were going. I understood. I could follow them. But the mother, Sonia, the character, the real live mother, because that's a book of non-fiction, even though it uses fictional techniques in the way I construct it, she was a specific character, and I wanted to be true to her way of seeing the world, her form of disturbance, one could say. She was far more disturbed than my mother was. My mother was never, as they used to put it, that awful term they had in those days, put away, right? My mother somehow soldiered on. She got through somehow. But she would be in mental homes for up to a year at a time. And the boys would have to go into other people's homes, or there was a Jewish home that catered for kids like that. And so I wanted to be true to that particular drama. And story is the art of the specific. If you try to generalize, then it's no longer story. You're losing the plot. Story. So I wanted to honor her as to who she was. But let's look at that. What does that mean, honoring her? Everyone knew about her. Well, those who knew the Nissen twins, they knew that there was this drama taking place. The close friends, the trainer, their boxing trainer, when he read the fighter, said, I never knew. He was surprised by it all. I didn't know you were carrying that burden, in a sense. But then when I'm sitting down and doing the research, say, and the research is based on these conversations, I was looking also for the light. And I remember, and the light comes through in 4 words. If I remember them, that is borscht, crystal, winter coats, and sponge cake, right? And you're alert to it. You're having a conversation. Oh, she used to make sponge cakes, and she had raisins that she chucked in. That was something of her own. And they sank to the bottom. And then Sandra's telling me how they cut it in half, and she liked the bottom half of a slice of cake because it had more raisins. And then, she loved crystal. There was a crystal cabinet in that room. She used to make beautiful winter coats. She was a skilled seamstress, right? She made borscht. She was great at making borscht, and we loved it. So you see what I'm getting at here. You've got to be careful, once again, that you don't reduce people to one thing or the other, that you see them in the full expanse of who they are as human beings.
Arnold, I want to talk with you now about the writing process itself. You spoke before about storytelling on stage and how the story evolves as you're telling it. But in your writing process, do you map out the storyline before you start writing and then follow it, or does it evolve as you write?
That's a fantastic question, Alan, and I would say it's more the latter. If I was on a desert island and someone said, I've got one question to ask you about storytelling, or you've got a chance to say only one thing about the art of story, what would it be? I would say, follow the story. Follow the story. Don't try to contain it. Don't try to put it in a straitjacket, follow the story. And in a way, I lean towards that, where I say, okay, I'm going to write a story set in Carlton. Let's begin. Late at night, weaving in and out of his dreams comes the neighing of a horse. You know, the night that Josh is lying in bed and hearing the milkman come. That's how it began. And let's see where it takes us. And in the process, you start to find your way. In The Fighter, I literally follow Henry Nissen around town in his yellow Hyundai, and he's taking me to the places where I need to go. Amazing places, the back lanes where he's looking after disaffected youth, and finally to Fight Night in Flemington, where they have it now across the road from the high-rise flats in a place called the Pavilion. All of that, all those. So you're following it, and the story is evolving as you go. But there is this, what I would call an interaction between spontaneity and planning. So at a certain point, you begin to find the best way to tell the story. So there's a story, but what's the best way, or the way you're going to settle upon to tell it? So at a certain point, you say, okay, Scraps of Heaven, I think I found the way I want to really tell it, and that is I want 4 seasons, you know, a few characters and a few days in summer, autumn, spring, winter and spring. Right, and then it allows you to have a narrative arc of a certain kind and character development across time. In Jewels and Ashes, that was probably the easiest one, because that's a narrative of a journey. So you have, the narrative arc presents itself. It begins and ends in Melbourne, but then you have to deal with other problems. Because if you're basing it on a journey that takes place in 1986, how do you go back seamlessly to the past? So you're learning the craft of how you move in time and space too, as you go. And I remember with Jewels and Ashes how I ended part 1, and then I realised that I'd spent the whole of part 1 avoiding the darkness. But in a way, that created the tension that explodes in part 2. You know, so these are the things that you learn. And the other thing is that you also try, as far as possible, to practice the art of scene construction. And that is, you enter into a scene. Once you enter into the scene, things begin happening. So the scene of the milkman coming, which leads to the scene of my mum in the backyard, or the character based on her in the backyard at the wash house. Each scene has to be fully imagined. And so sometimes as I'm writing, it leads me to having to do more research so that I can get the specific details that will make a scene come to life. So this is how it goes for me. Sea of Many Returns, the novel set in Ithaca, and in Kalgoorlie and Melbourne, that's purely about Greek immigrants. So I'm not there at all. But they are the stories I've heard over the years at Ithacan gatherings and on the island. In that particular novel, I draw on a technique developed by Faulkner, the great American writer, of multiple first-person points of view. The story is basically told in the first person by 2 characters, the granddaughter who comes to the island and she says, I'm going to translate my grandfather's manuscript. The grandfather is partly based on Dora's maternal grandfather. But I made up the manuscript, right? But it took me a while. It took me a while to find that way of telling that particular story. So I guess what we come back to, Allan, is that it is a craft. And it's a craft that has got a history, and through reading and through working through it, right, you begin to get the skill level and the techniques that enable you to tell the story you want to tell.
And like any craftsman, I'm sure you are incredibly proud of your work. So you finish writing the book, and then you give it away to an editor to have a look at. How does that feel, knowing that somebody's going to pore over this with a microscope, come back and tell you to change things, take something out, do something that you perhaps aren't all that comfortable with?
Well, look, you know, I have been blessed with great editors. And I think that maybe it is because I came to writing late. I work hard to get the whole manuscript done before I hand it in. That tends to be my way, rather than show a few chapters. And I really have had great editors, and you enter into a creative tension. There's a kind of creative tension, but it is a creative tension. And in my last 4 books, plus a project we did on reviving Hertzbergner's Between Sky and Sea. So the last 5 projects I've done with text, I've had the one editor, Jane Pearson, who, the bottom line is, she likes the way I write, right? And we all have different likes and dislikes. Some writers turn some people on and don't turn other people on. She happens to like the way I write. She's got, and that's a great starting point, and it goes from there. And she's tough, and I have to work out. What I take on board and what I don't take on board. But I think editing is a vital part of the process of producing a story that hopefully is can shine and is at its best. And so the process, it's challenging, but I think it's necessary. And I think you can tell there are some Australian writers who have done very well in their early books, but and have gotten into a position where they can tell editors, I don't need you, and you can start seeing some of the things that can happen in those instances. So, but it's a tricky thing. It really is. And there are many notorious stories about what can happen between editors and writers, but I think that the editing process is very, very important, and the best of editors, I'll say, in the end, it's your decision. No one is telling you what to do. Now, if we're talking about editors, and you're taking this conversation in very interesting directions, Allan. If you're talking about editors, there are a rough distinction between 2 types of editors. There is the big picture editor, and there is the detail, the editor that's good on detail, and the best combined the 2. But with Cafe Scheherazade and Scraps of Heaven and Sea of Many Returns, I had a wonderful big picture editor as well, and that was Michael Hayward, who is the CEO of Text, and he did marvelous things. He'd say things like, "Oh, he could detect an absence." Right? He could detect an absence. And so, the book's done, and he says, look, you've got a character called Bloomfield who circulates the streets of Carlton, and he's carrying a tragedy within him, and he can't abide to be inside. And then you've got Zofia, who also is carrying a trauma within her, but she can't abide to be outside. She retreats to the house. Why don't you have them meeting? Right? And not only that, then he says, go and read King Lear, right? And look at the relationship between old Tom the Fool and King Lear, and look at how old Tom the Fool enables Lear to go mad. Look, Allan, this is editing as genius. So I go away, I think about it, I read those scenes, and I think that scene where Bloomfield comes into the house and he triggers Zofia. It's a wonderful scene, and I owe it in a way to that sharp eye of Michael, that ability to really see where it could be taken to another level. He did the same in Cafe Scheherazade too. He said this is a love story on one level of Rom and Masha. How come they're not touching? And I'm thinking, does he want me to write sex scenes or whatever? But no, I began to re-explore the relationship. And what I discovered one day, talking to Masha and Avram, is that, yes, Avram emerges from the forest, 15 years old, and he's hardened He's already hardened. And then they fall in love. He's still quite, I think he was about 18, 19 when they met. And Marsh said, yes, there were times when he would approach me and he couldn't, or I'd approach him and I'd try to touch him and he would shudder. He would shudder. He couldn't bear to be touched. See, and that becomes a very important part of not only the book, but in the play. It's the most confronting scene in the whole play. The whole audience at that point feels that he cannot be touched. So once again, that's an editor that probes and interrogates your manuscript, and you go away thinking, oh yes, and finally it takes it to another level.
Arnold, I want to go in a different direction with you now, totally away from writing, and I want to talk with you about your advocacy for refugees and people seeking asylum, as well as for Indigenous Australians. Now, recently, we all, but especially you, got some fantastic news with your friend Behrouz Booshani being granted permission to live in New Zealand. You've been an outspoken and passionate spokesperson for refugees and the rights of people seeking asylum in Australia. When did you become an activist for these causes, and does that also go back to multicultural Carlton where you grew up?
Yes, I think it does to some degree. I think it goes back to the great Bund mentors I had, like Bonavina, and also it goes back to the stories we heard of the Edelmans of the world. I mean, Marek Edelman I finally met. I think he's the most remarkable person I ever met. And also, yeah, Carlton, we saw the connections that went beyond their own tribe. You know, we could see that we're not the only tribe that's suffering. So all these things are swirling around. But I guess, you know, Alan, you know what the real answer to that is? There is a scene that threads into quite a few of my books. And it's a scene that haunts me. And it does come from what happened to our own people, you know, in those dark years of the Second World War. And that is of lines of refugees, of people fleeing. I've got that scene in Jewels and Ashes, people fleeing Bialystok. I've got that scene in Cafe Scheherazade. I've got that scene in Scraps of Heaven. I've got that scene in The Fighter. You know, it's in the Greek novel too. Scenes where you have columns of refugees in flight, uprooted, in search of safety, in search of a haven. And it's so indelibly a part of who I am, like, in a sense, a part of who we are, you and I, and the way we were brought up. And the Geneva Conventions, there were 30, and there's also the immediate post-war years too. Bergen-Belsen, you know, which I described yet again in the story of Sonia Lizaron in The Watermill, the new book. Bergen-Belsen was a DP camp where people spent 5 years in limbo, waiting. The doors were closed. Many doors were closed to those people. The last DP camp was closed in 1951. You know, Manus lasted 6.5 years. So there are some interesting parallels. I think all of that is there within me. And then when things really began happening, I guess I was just alert to it. And I remember the first columns that I wrote in what became many columns was when John Howard came to power in 1996, because immediately he began doing things like cutting humanitarian, the numbers under that could come under the humanitarian visa, cutting here, cutting there, casting aspersions on other groups, and so I responded to it, and by that time I had the power of the pen, and I began writing regularly. And then more dramatic things began to take place, and you had those seminal moments. Look, I'll never forget, Alan, the first time I heard that in my city, in Melbourne, there was a place called Maribyrnong Detention Centre. It was late 2000, where men, women, and children were locked up. For what? For being who we were just a generation or two ago. And I started going to Maribyrnong, and one of my first pieces was called Diary of Despair, an account of my first half dozen visits there. And also I began writing articles about people I began to meet who were in limbo and on temporary protection. But yet again, Allan, the stories I want to tell, the activism for me has to come out of relationships. Now, these are people, I began writing about people that I began walking the streets with them at night, where they would be walking, one of them, Allan, the streets of Fitzroy, where there was a group of Hazaras who lived in the high-rise flats. And there was one guy I used to walk with him at night. He'd call me, I need to walk with you, right? Because he was missing his wife and his 3 children back who were stuck back in Afghanistan and then Pakistan. And so, and once again, we go back to this issue of familiarity, walking with a man like that, or seeing those families in the Maribyrnong, I know I could identify, I could relate to it. It was like relating to my own family. So it all came out of that. And then it took many forms. I think one of the most, going back to Beirut Buchani, I was contacted in 2014 because I was very active in Penn International and Melbourne Penn and we've done a number of cases like this of writers we discovered were in detention centres. And so this, can you adopt, there's this guy, stuck in Manus, he's a journalist, he's a writer. So this is when our relationship began, and it became a relationship, Allan. To this day, I spoke to him just a few days ago. He was elated, of course. He's finally gotten his freedom assured, his safety assured. And this, it became a conversation, and even a documented conversation. We had a dialogue that we published from time to time. But the most moving part of it was just the personal relationship. We would talk literature. He didn't want to be defined only as a refugee. Sometimes he'd call late at night and he'd say, Arnold, you could see he was on a downer, as all of them were going on downers and becoming very depressed. Although in Beirut's case, he had his art, he had his writing to sustain him. I think that's what helped him get through. So yeah, once again, look, I guess the 2 most difficult stories I've had to write about asylum seekers were both stories, one in Violin Lessons, The Ancient Mariner, and the final story in The Watermill, about survivors of the Sevex disaster, where 353 men, women and children drowned en route to Australia. And I got to know 5 or 6 of the 7 survivors who settled in Australia, in particular Amal Basri, a wonderful Iraqi woman, and Faraz Shohani, who from a Kurdish background, who sings the lullaby to the daughter he lost to the sea. But as I was doing those stories and those projects, the idea came to me that maybe we can republish Between Sky and Sea by Hertz Bergner, Zwischen Himmel und Yam. Now, here's a book, and Tex did it, and I've got an introduction to it that makes the parallels, between this story of a ship en route to Australia, Jewish refugees on a Greek freighter, and making their way, and it's a ship of characters, crazy people who are carrying with them the trauma of what had just occurred. It's very prescient, that book. It was written in the war years, and it came out in English translation. And so when I was hearing the stories of the Sevex survivors of that boat that sank, because the boat in Bergner's story sinks at the end. There is no happy ending. So when I was listening to their stories, I was hearing something that was quite familiar. And I think Bergner's story was in part based on the example of the St. Louis, that boat that, left Europe in 1938, 39, or late 30s, and was turned away from port after port after port. So it's there. You have to respond.
Look,
It's in our DNA, Alan, I'm afraid.
I want to take you back now about 54 years when you were the Lager Commandant of a camp that I attended at Port Fairy. You organised a visit to Framlingham, an Aboriginal community near Warrnambool, and I think we spent some time working on that site. And that was really my first introduction to Indigenous Australia, other than some references in junior history textbooks to bark humpies, pickaninnies and boomerangs. Unfortunately, we haven't made much progress since then. But I understand the involvement with the refugee causes. What drew you to Indigenous Australian issues?
Once again, I think it was this sense of something is missing. Something is missing in the story of who we are, of where we are. I guess I began to sense it. And it's interesting, Framlingham, we went there, it was about 1966, 65, 66. And that had been an Aboriginal mission, and it had closed down, and people still clung to staying there. And it was just 4 years later, 1970, that it went back, the ownership returned to Indigenous people. And so things were beginning to happen back then. But I remember, I don't know what you remember of that, but I remember a sense of desolation. I remember a sense that things weren't right. But for me, the big turning point there were two big turning points. One was going to Papua New Guinea. And many times, I ended up going 7 or 8 times, and it became a big part of my life. I did an MA thesis on Papua New Guinea and race relations. But what I saw in Papua New Guinea, and once again, it's light and dark. We've got to be very careful here that we don't reduce stories to stories of victimhood, because in Papua New Guinea, I saw people who reveled living in the forest, reveled living and being river people or sea people, who reveled in this, what I call a more ecologically sustainable way of life. So people who were being called whatever they were being called, denigrated, or actually had a secret, a way of seeing things, a way of being in the world that we had a lot to learn from. And that's something I picked up in Papua New Guinea. But fast forward to Jewels and Ashes, and I finished Jewels and Ashes, and I begin thinking to myself, now, mate, I want to explore this vast mystery for once and for all. How come? I grow up in the city of ours, and I've heard many stories. I've begun to tell many stories of people from many lands, but not once in all my schooling, including an honours degree at Melbourne University in history, political science, not once had I heard the word Wurundjeri, Boonwurrung, Kulin Nation, Birrarung, which is the real name for the Yarra River, River of Mists. Why hadn't I heard, why didn't I know anything about the people who were part of this, who have been here for many, many years? For millennia. It's interesting, Alan. There is a line in the final story where we meet in the watermill, which says he came from the old world to the new. That's the way our parents see it. He came from the old world to the new, only to discover it was far more ancient than the old. I began to probe that mystery, and so I went to a workshop by Jim Berg, who was the chairman of the Kuri Heritage Trust, the founder, a good Ijmara man, beautiful man, and married to a Jewish woman, actually. And he showed me through an exhibition which showed Victorian Aboriginal history through Indigenous eyes. And we came to a map. and this map was a map of Victoria, and I knew instantly where I'd seen a map like it. It was a map, and it was called the Massacre Map. There were 68 sites where massacres had taken place between 1836 and 1853, and underneath it says many more died beyond prying eyes. And I'm thinking of the map I saw at a pavilion at the outskirts of Treblinka, of that whole area where so many massacres had taken place. And so I said to Jim Berg, how can I find out more? And he said, go and see Arnie Joy. So I drove up to Healesville, knocked on the door, and I'm telling you, Arnie Joy Wanden Murphy opened the door, and it opened into 50,000 years of history. She was the great niece of William Burrick, the last Ngurungaeta. She says, use that word, Arnold, the last leader of the Wurundjeri people. And on her walls was a photograph of her grandfather, Wandoon, Robert Wanden, who was a great Aboriginal activist too, and a father. So I began to explore it, and she took me on journeys, and other elders did too, but mainly Arnie Joy took me to wonderful places that were of significance to Indigenous people. And my first written piece on that was a story called A Tale of Two Cities, which was published in The Age in September 1995, where I explore the fact that, okay, this is the city we know, but there is another more ancient story. Now, Joy Murphy and other elders like Caroline Briggs, when it came to, the Boonwurrung territory down the coast, they've transformed my life. I drive around the city, and within me, I have the maps, the ancient maps. And so, my way of moving about the city and experiencing the city has been profoundly changed and enriched by those journeys. And so I think basically it stems from that intimate connections with people. Arnie Joy and I are still friends. So these are ongoing relationships too. And I think that's very important. That's part of the story. And more recently, a wonderful project I've come to have a connection with is a wonderful project that's set, and this is the future, Alan. This is one of the ways forward. There are many ways forward. I think we're actually at an exciting time. There's a renaissance going on in thinking about these issues and the sorts of relationships that we can form as we move forward. And when I was Vice-Chancellor's Fellow at Melbourne Uni, I started to tune into this project where the Grimwade Centre of Cultural Materials Conservation at Melbourne University, a wonderful institute led by Professor Robin Sloggett, they were given the task of rescuing and restoring these paintings that were destroyed in a flood, or badly damaged in a flood in Warman, which is near the Warman, associated with the Warman art movement, which is centered in the Kimberley, right near Turkey's Creek. And as they were restoring these paintings, they developed a relationship with the Gidja people and the Warman Art Centre. And finally, I was privileged to go up there and to witness the signing of the two-way learning agreement, where the Western and the Aboriginal knowledge systems are interacting in a very beautiful way. And I want the very first, I didn't want to name it in the story because I don't think I've earned the right yet to write about this place. I haven't. I think you've got to pay your dues. But the first paragraph of Where We Meet begins with an experience I had when I was up there, when I met these wonderful elders and artists and painters. And it goes like this, and I think it sums up a lot of what we've been talking about too. Being not enough listening, not enough sitting on the earth, sitting on the veranda, sitting in the shade beneath the house. The land as far as the eye can see, clad in ochres and reds. The sky so blue it hurts. The air so dry it sucks in the breath. Yet it is cool enough in the shade to converse, and there's time enough to take in the silence, to notice that far distant cloud. It's going to rain, the old man says. Give it 6 hours, but believe me, it's going to rain. Best place to be is here, sitting in the shade beneath the house. It all comes from the sitting together. That's where it comes from, I think.
Absolutely. And look, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you so much for your time. This has been fantastic, and I really thank you so much for joining us today. I look forward to reading more of your books, and I am following your regular blogs about how we're coping in the times of the plague. So Arnold, from me, bleib gesund, and hopefully we'll soon be able to meet face to face.
And thank you so much. They were wonderful questions, Allan. You put your heart and soul into it, so thank you so much.
Very welcome. You've been listening to a conversation with Arnold Zable, acclaimed Australian author, storyteller and tireless campaigner for social justice. Arnold shared with us insights into his writing, the writing process, and how he became involved in advocating for the rights of refugees and those seeking asylum in Australia, and for Australia's First Nations people. We follow the theme of Indigenous Australia in our next podcast, which features Yin Parodies, an Indigenous Australian and academic at Deakin University. In this podcast, we talk with Yin about his experiences growing up in Townsville in Darwin, his move into academia, the Black Lives Matter movement, the decision he and his Jewish wife took to send their children to Shalom Aleichem College in Melbourne, and how the Jewish community can become more active and effective in advocating for the rights of Indigenous Australians. We hope you'll join us. As we move into an even stricter isolation regime, we encourage you and yours to follow the rules, take care of yourselves and others. Many thanks to Allan Preiss, who produces our podcast and who also plays the Wir kommen on theme song. Bis wir treffen sich weiter, bleibt gesund und stark.